Dámy a pánové, milí přátelé, vítám vás všechny na tiskové konferenci s panem poslancem Evropského parlamentu Nigelem Faragem, po které bude následovat přednáška s názvem Pravda o Evropě. Přítomné novináře samozřejmě srdečně zveme i na tu vlastní přednášku, protože jistě nebude dostatek času na zodpovězení všech případných dotazů během těch několika minut, které pro tu tiskovou konferenci máme k dispozici. Pan Nigel Farage je čelným představitelem britské strany UKIP, strany za nezávislost Velké Británie, a je velmi známým kritikem Evropské unie jako poslanec Evropského parlamentu, kde působí od roku 1999. Je, jak říkám, asi nejznámějším oponentem evropské integrace, integračního procesu. Pan Nigel Farage zde není poprvé v Praze, nicméně ta jeho dnešní návštěva od samotného rána patří asi mezi ty nejproduktivnější. Za zmínku zvláště stojí to, že se sešel s panem prezidentem a v téměř hodinovém rozhovoru spolu vedli důležitou rozpravu právě o těch aktuálních událostech v Evropské unii. Na to ostatně se ho budete moci zeptat během té tiskové konference. Takže děkuji vám. Můžete, vážení novináři, klást svoje dotazy jak anglicky, tak česky. V případě, že položíte otázku česky, tak já ji přeložím. A jinak, co se týče vlastní přednášky, tak jste si jistě všimli, že máte k dispozici sluchátka, ta již bude simultánně tlumočena profesionálně, nikoli mnou, takže se ničeho neděste. A všechno bude přeloženo tak, jak se sluší a patří. Takže vítám mezi námi pana Nigela Farage a předávám mu slovo předtím, než se ujmete slova vy, páni a dámy, novináři, novinářky. Please, Nigel Farage, if you can say a few words before.
Well, thank you very much, and good to be here. It's my third visit to the Czech Republic. The last time I came was on a political mission 4 years ago, and the time before that was on a stag weekend, where I hope I behaved better than some of the English to come and visit this great city. I must say it's a very important time, not just in European politics, not just in terms of the future of the euro, but actually in terms of the very concept of democracy, of nation state, and of where are we going. And of course today's news has been dominated by the Greek elections yesterday, and remarkable, isn't it, that if you win in the Greek elections and come first, you get a bonus of 50 seats. It is a quite extraordinary system. And so a majority of people in Greece voted for parties that were not well disposed to the bailouts, and yet it is certain that the Greeks will get a government who are extremely well disposed, not just to the concept of the bailouts, but to obeying absolutely every dot and comma of the German, European, or perhaps a bit of both, agreement. So how, what has the response been to that? Well, of course, the professional career PC political class, not just across Europe but across the world, have welcomed these results, with people like Cameron and Obama saying it's absolutely wonderful. But you will note that today, on the financial markets, Spanish bonds and Italian bonds have both passed through the 7% level and are now at the worst state they've been at any point during this crisis. So, nobody's really impressed, nobody really thinks anything's changed, and certainly in terms of the fundamentals, economically, nothing in Greece has improved. And I do sometimes think that we tend to talk about the Eurozone crisis from a purely technical and financial perspective, and we seem to have sort of lost our marbles. We're not thinking about the human cost of this. A third of Greek people now living below the poverty line. Thousands of families who literally drop off their young children outside churches with signs round their neck saying, please look after this child, we can't afford to feed him or her. 25% of businesses have gone bankrupt in the last 4 years, and now the decline in the economy is going into, I think, a deflationary death spiral economically. You know, the Greek economy has fallen now something like 20% since the start of this depression, and they are stuck inside a currency that is probably valued about 50% too high for where they are. So I absolutely unapologetically think that the Eurozone has been a total misconstruction from the start, and that if we were good Europeans, and when I say good Europeans, some think I'm against Europe. I'm not against Europe. That would be rather difficult to be. You know, I've got a European wife. I worked, no, it's true. I worked for 2 French companies in my career when I had a real job. I worked for 2 French firms. Now, it's true to say they both sacked me for insubordination, but I'm trying not to bear the grudge. And I want to live and work in a Europe of trade and cooperation and harmony and being good next door neighbours, but not a Europe that has an artificial currency imposed upon it, and most definitely not a Europe with Herman Van Rompuy as its president. So I've come here today and been very honoured to be given for the second time the opportunity to meet your president, President Václav Klaus, who, whatever you think of him, whether you agree with his views or not, actually stands out amongst modern European politicians, really as a beacon, a man who intellectually is never bullied, is never swayed, and a genuine statesman. And I came to say to President Klaus that I think there is great room for optimism, that a democratic rebellion is underway across Europe. We saw it first in Finland, a country that had had a very stable structure in politics since 1945, and then last year, in the general election, the True Finns party, a party that is opposed to European integration, a party that is opposed to the bailouts, came within 1.5% of winning the general election. So we're seeing a democratic revolution that is underway. It's happening in the Netherlands, and it's happening to a certain extent within my country of the United Kingdom too. In the south of Europe, certainly public opinion has become fiercely Eurosceptic, though at the moment they haven't really got parties that are standing up and giving people the opportunity. So my message to President Klaus is, from the European Parliament, albeit I accept that I may be in a minority position there, but my message is that right across Europe, people are waking up to what has been done in their name. And what has been done in their name is their ability, through the ballot box, to determine their own futures has been taken away from them. Because now, most of our law is made for the institutions of the European Union. And whether they pass a good law, or whether they pass a bad law, isn't really the point. The whole point about general elections is that you start with a clean sheet. You should be able, in general elections, to vote for a government that is able to undo everything the previous government did, if it chooses to do so. That's the whole point of voting, of changing governments. With a European directive, it doesn't matter what the Czech electorate say, or the British electorate say, because there is nothing you as voters can do to change any of those laws. And actually, you can't be the masters of your own destiny. So, my chief message is one of hope. People realise what has been done in their name. They realise they've been signed up to a project that wants to become a United States of Europe, and they are rebelling against it. And I also told President Klaus that I'm perhaps quite well known for having rebelled against the system from within the European Parliament, and that I'm going to go on doing so, encouraged by the growth in opposition to this project that I see right across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Farage, for your introductory remarks. Now we can take a few questions, but only please from the press, not from the other visitors, because there will be time, a special time for your questions after the talk. So now please, the press, if you have any questions. Mr. Farage, please.
Michal Musek, Prague Daily. You have mentioned democratic revolution in Europe and three countries where it is according to you going, but if I'm not mistaken, the European Union consists of some 27 countries. So isn't it too few countries for such a big democratic revolution?
Well, the European Union is 27 countries, that's certainly true. But I use Finland actually as my example, not Greece. I explained to you that in Finland, since 1945, there have been three parties who have held nearly all the seats in Parliament, just the odd independent here and there, and then virtually from nowhere come along a party called the True Finns, opposing European integration, believing in national democracy, and they come within 1.5% of winning the general election. Look at the Netherlands. Quite remarkable. I remember being told in the mid-90s, well, Nigel, I'm afraid you will lose, because if you meet people who come from the Netherlands, they regard themselves as European first and Dutch second. This is what people used to tell me. Look at that country now. Look at the referendum they had on the EU constitution, where 2/3 of them gave a big Eurosceptic no. Look at the fact that on the right and the left in the Netherlands, there is real opposition to their membership of the European Union on its current terms. So they're just two examples. We've seen the rise in France of Euroscepticism. We're certainly seeing the rise of Euroscepticism in Britain. And I mean, yesterday, there was open speculation on national television that my party could win the next European elections. So, right across the north of Europe, we're seeing change, and I think there is optimism and reason to feel that that change will spread to the rest of Europe. But can I please just make one more point? There is a very common mistake that gets made, and it's this. It's a feeling that being opposed to this undemocratic European state is somehow a right-wing idea. Now, I was a supporter of Margaret Thatcher. I was a member of the Conservative Party. I'm an economic liberal. And I guess all of that puts me to the right of the political spectrum. But whether you believe in democracy, whether you believe in your own nation's state governing its own affairs, is not a right-wing or a left-wing concept. Democracy is actually there for people from right across the spectrum. And I think don't underestimate the left in Europe. I think we may well see much of the left go back to their original democratic roots, and we'll see left-wing parties opposing European Union as well. And I look forward to the day when, in the United Kingdom, I can have bitter arguments with socialists, and we can disagree on economics and all sorts of things, but confident in knowing that at least we will have the ability and the right to disagree and to settle these issues in general elections, and that our own government, if it gets it wrong, we can sack them and reverse all their legislation. And that does not exist in this European Union today.
Další otázka? Jestli nikdo jiný se hlásí z přítomných novinářů, tak jestli ne, tak zatím pan.
So you have mentioned the signals or the occurrences of Euroscepticism in Europe, but it's one thing, and in my view, democratic revolution is quite another thing. So even if you can show some examples of successes of Eurosceptic parties, it doesn't prove any huge democratic movement within Europe.
Well, I'm sorry, I mean, if I take the example of my party, which started, with a dozen people sitting in a pub somewhere off the Strand in London, thinking, what on earth are we going to do? And setting this party up and being mocked and derided, not just for who we were as people, but for everything we stood for, because we challenged a consensus that had not been challenged in Britain for 25 years. And certainly, not just UKIP, but Eurosceptic thinking in Britain in those days was what I would call a minority sport. You know, I mean, very, very few people thought there was much of a threat to it. And now in the opinion polls in Britain, 2/3 of Britons will vote in a referendum to leave the EU tomorrow and replace it with a genuine free trade agreement. We came in the last European elections second across the entire United Kingdom. There is speculation that indeed we could come first in 2014. I can suggest to you that that is actually remarkable progress for a Eurosceptic party. In fact, it all reminds me of a rather famous British comedian who's no longer with us. And this chap, Bob Monkhouse, was a real household name. Everybody knew who he was. Very, very, very good, funny stand-up comedian. And Bob used to have a line, and I think it's appropriate to Euroscepticism, certainly in Britain. Monkhouse used to say, when I was growing up, I told my friends and family that when I was older, I was going to become a comedian. And they laughed at me. Well, he said, they're not laughing now. and there is something of that in Euroscepticism. You know, we now represent the clear mainstream majority view amongst the population, if not amongst our current political classes. And my argument, sir, is that that gap between how the people feel and where the political class are is getting so wide that at some point something very dramatic is going to happen.
We have time for 2 more questions from the press.
If you were to pick one political party in Czech Republic which would suit you the best, which one would it be?
I'll give you that answer before the European elections of 2014. But what I would say is this, that there was a Czech party that used to say it was very Eurosceptic, but since they've gone to Brussels and been picked up at the airport in the smart Mercedes and gone to all the champagne receptions and earned money that is much higher, I think, than any of them would have earned if they stayed in Prague, I'm struck how much less Eurosceptic they are now than they were then. And therefore we need something fresh, strong and new to pose a real challenge in those Euro elections of 2014. And once that process, once that agglomeration of different groups has happened, I'll be pleased to answer the question.
Last question.
Mr. Farage, Czech President Václav Klaus recently speaks a lot about world governance, which he considers as the continuation of European government. Do you share this view? This view that EU is a model for future world government, and that this world government will be undemocratic and, to say, totalitarian.
Well, I mean, certainly there are people who argue that a single currency within Europe would mean that there was no difficulty in exchanging money, there was no risk, no transaction risk or cost, and that the logic of that argument is that if you do it for Europe, perhaps you can do it for the whole of the world. So there are people out there who believe in global government. I personally am a little bit cautious about conspiracy theory. However, I would say this, that the International Monetary Fund, which since 1945, I think to most intents and purposes, done a wonderful job, now appears to have become a branch office of the European Commission and the European Central Bank. I mean, they had this Dominic Strauss-Kahn fellow running it, who got into a bit of trouble, but he clearly thought the IMF was there just to bail out Eurozone countries, and when he got booted out, he was replaced by Christine Lagarde, another French federalist, another fellow architect of this Euro failure, and everyone's being told they must keep pumping money into the IMF to shore up a currency that is going to bust anyway. I think global governance is failing, and I thought it was jolly interesting last week, Stephen Harper, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, and I think a very, very interesting, very sound man in many ways, met with Barroso in Brussels and said, do not expect 1 cent more Canadian money to be poured in via the IMF to prop up your failing currency. So I think that the global governance agenda is about to have a few very serious setbacks, and I'm very pleased about that.
Thank you very much. We'll have a 5-minute break before the talk starts.